Hello and welcome to The Informed Animal Ally, presented by the Vancouver Humane Society. This is the Animal Ethics Podcast, where we share the ins and outs of topics like cruelty, legislation, and advocacy here in BC and across Canada. Hi, I'm Chantelle Archambault, Communications Director for the Vancouver Humane Society. With me today is VHS's Executive Director, Amy Morris.
Hello.
This month, to talk about the bonds between humans and our companion animals, we're welcoming Dr. Sasha Protopopova.
Hello.
And Dr. Camila Cavalli.
Hello.
From the University of British Columbia. Thank you so much for being here. Sasha is an assistant professor at UBC and the NSERC BCSPCA Industrial Research Chair in Animal Welfare. She has a PhD and a Master of Science in Behavior Analysis and a bachelor's degree in Pre-Veterinarian Animal Science and a bachelor's degree in Neuroscience. Sasha's research aims to improve animal shelter practices, improve companion animal welfare through the development of behavioral interventions in shelters, as well as pet homes, and assess and improve on the well-being of working dogs working in assistance roles. Camila is a postdoctoral researcher at UBC. She believes a deeper understanding of the way dogs communicate with humans is vital to improve our relationship with them and protect their welfare, and she devotes her career to the study of dog cognition. Her PhD is focused on the socio-cognitive abilities of therapy dogs who visit people in places like hospitals, nursing homes, and schools. As a postdoc, she's expanding her research to learn more about the characteristics of successful therapy dogs, their motivation, and the welfare benefits of giving dogs the option to opt in.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I got to work on a project with Sasha thinking about kind of the relationship between humans and dogs. And it was such a delightful experience that I am, just so excited to hear what both researchers have to say today. How did you become interested in human-animal interaction? I'd love to hear from both of you.
Yeah, I can start. Thank you so much for having both of us. I think what led me first into it as a child is I think I had a very kind of important, great connection to dogs and to horses and to kind of other animals that were around me at the time. I think so much so that I would say that my best friend was a dog when I was a child in Russia. And and so I had a lot of kind of deep connections already with animals as I was growing up. But I imagined, I didn't really know what I could do with that in terms of a career. I was reading all these books about veterinarians, about maybe research in Africa with primates. And I was kind of imagining that maybe I should probably be a veterinarian of some kind. And so I kind of went down that path in my early education. And so I was imagining that I was going to go to vet school. But that didn't really pan out. I decided that actually I was much more interested in behavior, much more interested in domesticated animals specifically, and kind of how they related to us than just thinking about their physiology. And so I switched and really went into research instead of veterinary medicine.
Yeah, I think we all thought at some time to be vets. In my case, it was the opposite as a child. I couldn't have a pet and I really wanted to have a dog. So I was obsessed with everything about dogs and I would read all the time about them, but I couldn't have one. So I really wanted to interact more with dogs. And I was thinking, I'm totally going to be a vet when I grow up. But then once I realized they were working more on the physiology or working with animals who are sick and not really, they weren't playing with dogs all day. So then I was like, well, maybe not. And I decided to study psychology because, again, I was really interested in behavior, but I wasn't such a fan of humans. So I was like, well, maybe I can find other types of behavior. And then I met my former PI who works studying dog behavior in Argentina. And I was like, this is perfect. I'm finally studying dogs. And at the time I had a dog finally. I don't need to be working with them in the same way of a vet, like doing aversive or annoying things to them. Like I'm not giving them a shot. I can play with them in the lab and give them treats or to play with them. And it was the combination of my interest in behavior and dogs. But my focus has always been dogs in particular. Like, of course, I care and know about other species, but dogs. And all my examples and all are going to be just dogs.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your backgrounds. We're absolutely so interested to talk about your perspectives on companion animal relationships. I would love to hear a little bit more about your research in this area.
Yeah, I started my graduate school. It was really focused on animal shelters. I was a dog trainer before as an undergraduate student. And so I first thought that I was going to probably pursue research in dog training itself. But my former supervisor, Dr. Clive Wynne, suggested that I go visit the local shelter and kind of see what's going on in there, perhaps with thinking about like, how can I combine the two fields? So what can I do as a dog trainer within animal shelters to improve adoption rates of dogs? And so I started with that, and I went to the shelter. I kind of naively thought that probably if I were to just kind of train some cute behavior in a dog, for sure adoptions will go up and all the world problems will be solved. And so I did that for my master's thesis. I trained a cute behavior. It was a cute gaze into the eyes of potential adopters from dogs. And so that was successful in terms of the training perspective. It was totally unsuccessful in improving adoptions. So I saw no increases in adoptions at all with the cute kind of gazing into the eyes of adopters. And so that, I think, made me realize that I was rather naive and kind of really coming at it from just really the dog perspective, or really like a dog trainer perspective, and not really thinking about it from a more holistic, more kind of understanding human-animal interactions, and not really understanding what people were really looking for when they were coming into the shelter, and that I was kind of forgetting about the human side of things. and then from then on, all of my research really kind of focused not really only on the animals, but really more on that human side. So what is it that people are looking for in dogs? Whether it is to increase adoption rates, for example, for my doctoral research, or later on with our work with Camila, when we're looking at what kind of benefit, or what do dogs do that may increase or decrease benefit for humans in therapy dog context or something like that. So all of these things are connecting the human experience, not just the animal experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, that's so cool. Yeah, in my case, I started as an undergrad in Dr. Ventusella's lab. As I mentioned, I found a person studying dog behavior, and I latched onto her. I did my undergrad thesis with her studying post-conflict reconciliation in dogs and humans, which basically it was something that was studied in primates and, of course, in humans, but there wasn't a lot in dogs, so we did a little study on that. Then for my PhD, I started focusing on therapy dogs, which I have continued to up to now with Sasha at UBC. And yeah, I think, again, at times in my research, I focus more on the dog and how they behave and their social cognitive abilities, but it's, of course, always important to consider the human part of those interactions, and in therapy dogs research is, of course, very, very central to the whole topic, to consider everyone that's there, not only the child, for example, and the dog, but also a handler that's communicating all the time with the dog and with the child, and it's a very complex situation.
Yeah, thanks so much for sharing that. I'm curious about whether the way that you look at human-animal interaction varies by species, and if so, in what ways?
What an interesting question. Certainly. As Camila, I'm also quite dog obsessed. So my personal research has really been with one species, the dog. But I was very lucky to have worked with other graduate students who have studied different species, and one of which that comes to mind right away are cats. And so this is work by a current PhD student, Bailey Egan. And so one of her studies in her research, her overall line of research is to help cats do well in an animal shelter context, especially cats that are coming in from quite difficult circumstances. For example, like a hoarding environment where they don't necessarily get a lot of socialization opportunities with other people. They might have some genetic, developmental issues, health issues. And so they are coming in quite needy, both behaviorally and medically. And then we, as an animal shelter or rescue or rehabilitation services, need to devise some programs, some ways to help them find successful homes, rather than kind of outcomes that we prefer not to have for animals like that. And so in that context, there were some interesting aspects of the cat-human relationship that were certainly very different from the dog-human relationship. Some things were different, but some things are also very, very similar. In terms of, for example, gauging how successful some rehabilitation programs are with the cats, we looked at sociability towards humans. And this is something that is quite similar to dog research, or kind of how we think of what is a successful dog in the sense of in the shelter is one who is safe and is also seeking out human attention, is enjoying human attention, and is successfully interacting with humans. I think there, though, for cats, probably safety is not the largest kind of predictor of successful relationship, although I think I say this more anecdotally rather than from an empirical perspective, or perhaps a little bit empirical. Actually, another set of data comes to mind from another PhD student in my lab, Lexis Lee. And Lexis has done quite a bit of research where she is combining data sets, kind of one data set with another data set. So she's a data scientist. And one of the things that she did was looked at what were the reasons for surrender of cats and dogs to animal shelters and kind of why people selected rehoming, self-rehoming versus rehoming to a shelter. But one thing she has done is she's compared cats and dogs, or people who have rehomed cats and dogs, and what were the reasons for rehoming. And some were similar, but fewer people surrendered or cited safety or cited aggression issues, behavioral issues for cats than dogs. And so I think there's some similarities. But overall, I think the connection that people have towards companion animals as they kind of seek them out for adoption is in some ways quite similar. We have some other research that is just starting out with rabbit and human interactions. So perhaps if we do this podcast again next year, I might have some other things to say about rabbits or rats.
Oh, wonderful. I'd be so interested to hear about that. Camila, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'm the dog person, so I don't know a lot about other species besides, of course, interacting sometimes with cats or other species. I think it's important to consider when we are thinking about human-animal interactions that, yeah, we should be talking about animals that are comfortable with humans, because sometimes people may try to interact with animals who they shouldn't be interacting with, and because, of course, that may be dangerous for people, but also because it's something that's uncomfortable for the animal and it affects their welfare. So not because they look cute, maybe we should try not to pet a raccoon that we find in our neighborhood. So I think that's also something to consider for people, and that, of course, humans interact in different ways with the world, so we can learn about species or look at them, but not physically interact with all of the species, even if we want to.
One thing, Camila and I are really focused on companion animals. And so we certainly are answering these questions from that perspective, that we really are only focusing on kind of, when you say other species, we're thinking cats, dogs, maybe horses, maybe rabbits, rats, and anyone that people have that very personal connection with. But yesterday I had the privilege to attend a book launch by Dr. David Fraser, who's retired from our animal welfare program. And there he read some kind of tidbits from his new book, or his new edition of the book, Understanding Animal Welfare. And he was highlighting how there are so many different societal kind of influences in how we perceive our interactions with animals, or kind of how we're very specious in our care for animals. And I'm not going to say this correctly, but it was something, there was kind of an example of something along the lines where a typical farmer may in the morning go with his elderly dog to the veterinarian to figure out a way to spend money to prolong this dog's life. At the same time, in the afternoon, send, 6-week-old piglets to slaughter, and then set up a trap in the evening for a pesky coyote. Kind of highlights that within a given day, we might have so many different relationships with animals, and that's only really dependent on our kind of cultural attitudes or value systems as we relate to animals, or historical aspects. So it is quite interesting how, Camila and I are very, very much focused, very narrow in companion animals, but there's just so many other types of human-animal interactions that are out there.
Yeah, that's a great point. We are focusing on companion animals today, but we've absolutely talked about the needs and interactions of farmed animals, wildlife. So that's really interesting to hear about. It sounds like both of you have really fascinating projects about human-animal interaction. I would love to hear more about those, and if there are any results from those that surprised you.
Yeah, I think even going back to my doctoral research, where I was looking at what increases adoption rates in dogs, I think what was surprising to me is there are very kind of few things that people look for when they're selecting a dog. And I was imagining that people had all these behavioral selection criteria when they're going into the shelter, and they're really kind of selecting based on some kind of match between the family and the dog. And one thing that I was surprised by was that a lot of that selection was based on the morphology of the dog. So the cute little puppies are going to go home much faster, or kind of small breeds are going to go faster. The certain kind of interesting long coats are going to go faster than other dogs. And so I think in that part, I was surprised that looks mattered much more than the behavior of the dog. But perhaps I shouldn't have been surprised. I think that perhaps this is kind of the problem of the human condition generally, that we go after looks first and then the match or the behavior second. So in that sense, I think I was kind of surprised about that. But it also made me kind of realize that I shouldn't be just basing my research questions based on those assumptions that I had about how people kind of engage with animals. Instead, that there is plenty of opportunity for empirical investigations into human-animal interactions, so that if we do want to devise some kind of programs to improve adoptions, for example, or create some kind of change for the better for society in terms of animal welfare, that we have to actually start with that initial collection of data.
Yeah, that's a great point.
Yeah, in my case, I think maybe a bit surprising for me was when I started comparing therapy dogs and pet dogs, that they weren't all that different in a lot of things. So it wasn't like they were magical therapy dogs in every aspect I was measuring. But of course, I did find some differences, for example, in the case in behavior, and they would communicate more with humans in some situations. And that makes sense because in their sessions, as I said, it can be a very complex situation with different people, with things that may be unpredictable happening. So it makes sense for them to be looking at their handler or be looking at people much more maybe than family dogs that don't have these experiences.
Another one that I think I was surprised overall, thinking about therapy dogs or therapy animals, was how little the handlers of those animals seem to understand their own animals. So I say that, and I can kind of reference a couple of studies. So one of the studies was by my master's student, Megan Arendt, for master's thesis, who was curious about the welfare of therapy dogs. And she wanted to ask the question of whether, if given a choice, if therapy dogs actually wanted to engage with children or if they would choose to just go away. And it really was the handlers who were kind of pushing this volunteerism or volunteer kind of things onto the dogs. And so she devised a couple of experiments, and she recruited therapy dogs who were registered therapy dogs and whose owners or handlers said that their dog's favorite thing are children. So the favorite population of these particular dogs were children to kind of hang out with and interact with. And so she had that subsample of like theoretically or hypothetically very, very interested in children dogs. And then she asked those dogs some questions behaviorally. And so one of those was kind of a button press experiment where the dogs were trained to press one of two buttons by trials. And one of the buttons essentially just kept the dog in the room. So it was nothing, it was a control button. And another button led the dog out for a break out of the room. And in the control condition, that room was empty. And so we wouldn't expect any differences in the button pressing. But in the experimental condition, the room contained a child. And that child would follow the dog and interact with the dog in a very typical type of animal-assisted intervention kind of type of session where there is some physical interaction between the child and the dog. And these therapy dogs are registered therapy dogs. And so this is something they have experience with. And so she saw that some dogs did elect to start pressing the button more to stay in the room. So this is great because this tells us that, the therapy dogs were really enjoying their sessions with the child. But what was surprising was that not all of those therapy dogs did that. We would hypothesize that all of those dogs are really in love with children, as their handlers will say. But in fact, most of the dogs really didn't care about the child either way. So there was no change from baseline to the experimental condition. And in fact, a few dogs really actively started wanting to be escaping. And this is, of course, very, very concerning because, again, these are not just pet dogs. These are therapy dogs whose handlers say they love children, and yet they still want to escape that room when the child is present, highlighting that handlers don't always know what their dogs are actually telling them. And in the same vein, there was another study that was very interesting, but this time with therapy horses, also conducted by Megan Arendt and another colleague of mine, Dr. Katie Schrader, who was an equine-assisted mental health professional. This was a study conducted with therapy horses, and these horses were used in sessions with children, so very much similar to kind of the dog sessions. And one of the activities in these sessions is to have the child groom the horse. And a lot of the times when you hear these sessions being discussed in the public media, it's said that the horses really love the grooming. The grooming is part of that connection between the horse and the child. And this is where that kind of positive benefits are arising between the horse and the child, and both are really enjoying that connection. And it makes it seem like the horse is an active part of this experience and is really engaging positively with the child in that way. And so we devised a very simple experiment asking horses whether they actually enjoy grooming. And again, these are all therapy horses. Taught horses a simple task of touching their noses onto a hand of the experimenter, or technically a fist of the experimenter. And this was just a quick behavior to train the horse. And we could use that trained behavior to then start putting in kind of if we were to use food, and every time the horse would touch the hand, it would get food, would it keep working for that? Compared to if it got nothing, it would probably stop working. So it would stop touching the hand. This is a very simple method to ask animals whether some kind of item is rewarding. So if some item is rewarding, they're going to keep working to access that item. But if some other item is not rewarding, they'll just stop working for it. And so knowing that we had a positive control of food, because we know animals love food, they're going to work for food. We also had a negative control of nothing, because we know if you provide nothing, animals will not engage in work for free. And so then knowing now we had a positive and negative control, then we had our experimental condition where if the horse touched their nose onto our fist, then they got a little bit of grooming in a very typical fashion of the therapy sessions. And then we looked at how many nose touches were emitted by the horses and compared those nose touch frequency or rate of nose touching to the condition with the food, which was a positive control, and the nothing, which was the negative control. And quite sadly, for all of the horses, they completely did not care about the brushing, and for no horse worked for the brushing. So the data looked identical for that negative control and the brushing, showing that for the horse, brushing was equivalent to nothing, certainly not as exciting as the food. And this kind of experiment was really a replication of other research that was done with dogs, also suggesting that if you ask the dog, what do you like? Do you like your owner saying, good boy, good job? They don't care about that. That means essentially zero to them compared to food. Petting is a little bit okay for dogs, but again, if you compare that to food, that's not exciting. And so here we saw, again, with horses, they really didn't care about that brushing. But getting back to that kind of therapy animal question, I think what was interesting, but perhaps not surprising, I would say, is that I think when it comes to therapy animals, we tend to get a bit romantic, and we tend to kind of imagine that there's all this magical benefit or magical kind of connections between animals and humans and children. And that may be so, but I worry that occasionally, because of this kind of romanticism superimposed on these activities, that we tend to forget to really watch the animal, and we forget to really consider that we may be wrong, and maybe this is not the correct situation for this animal, and they're not necessarily getting as much pleasure or as much benefit as we're imagining they're getting. And maybe the benefit is really our projections of what we're getting out of it. And so I think that is kind of an interesting lesson that data has shown, for me at least.
That's so interesting. I love the idea of being able to research and quantify when animals are opting in to an activity. We had an episode last year on training dogs and cats, and opting in was a major part of it, and having the animal give their consent for activities. I think the study about grooming is very telling, and I think we see the same sort of thing when people talk about petting farms, where they're very romanticized with the children are getting that experience, and the animals love it too. But what we end up seeing is that the animals are in these really loud environments where they're quite stressed. Jumping back to companion animals, a lot of our listeners share their lives with companion animals. Both of us certainly do. Do you have any advice that you would give to someone who wants to learn more about their own relationship with their companion animal?
What an interesting question. One thing one can do probably is to have some kind of understanding of that baseline relationship at the moment, and whether they are satisfied in that relationship that they have. And what I mean by that, maybe going back to kind of a point earlier, that sometimes we humans tend to not really look at the animals and really just kind of assume that there is a certain relationship, whether there's a certain benefit from both that we're getting. And so I'm also a dog behavior consultant. And so in my cases where I've gone into homes, and of course I'm called because there's some behavior issue, there's a problem in the home, and I'm called in and asked to kind of solve the dog's problem. I think there's a lot of situations where the owners have kind of inaccurately determine some aspects of the relationship between themselves and their dogs. For example, one thing comes to mind. I was in a home environment with a German Shepherd and his owner, and the German Shepherd has previously had a lot of very aversive-based training. And what I mean by that, there was kind of a lot of forcefulness exuded on the dog, and the dog was not allowed to engage in any behaviors other than when commanded by the owner. And so the dog was very kind of inhibited in his behavior, wouldn't move, wouldn't engage in toy play, wouldn't engage in even like eating food was quite difficult for this dog. So kind of a very shut down type of dog. Whereas the owner's assessment of that situation is that the dog is very well trained and respects him as the leader and the owner and whatnot. And so kind of honestly looking at that situation, as a third party kind of coming in and looking at that relationship, to me, it was a rather sad one, where the dog really was not benefiting from that relationship, where there was a lot of suppression of the dog's natural state, natural behaviors. There was a lot of kind of a lack of enjoyment in the dog's life. And that was evident by me trying to offer different foods to the dog and the dog just not eating. So showing a lot of kind of really lack of motivation to eat, lack of motivation to play. When I would ask the dog for kind of any interaction, for example, asking them to come with me or to do anything, I would see a lot of avoidance behaviors. So instead of kind of having the dog go forward to me or kind of be curious, I would see a lot of turning away, a lot of stress behaviors like ears back, kind of tail tucked. And that again kind of signified to me that perhaps the previous interactions with humans that this dog had was not necessarily a pleasant one. But again, this kind of from the owner's perspective, the trainers before said, well, this is good because this is the dog showing you that you're dominant, the dog is submissive, ears back is a good thing, and so on and so on. And so it's tricky, I think, when it's hard to know who's the expert, I think, especially when it comes to dog training. And so I wonder if it's really important in that case to get that education about body language, get that education about learning theory, and kind of really truly understand and evaluate whether you are providing a good life to your animal and how you can improve, honestly. But it's such a tricky one, right? There's just so many components to this and we never know what we don't know. So yeah, that's a hard one.
Yeah, it's really interesting question. And yeah, I was thinking along the same lines that how many times people assume that animals should like something because they like it and they may not. And somebody was telling me this recently that she was saying her dog doesn't respect her because he doesn't want her to touch him. And I'm like, well, but how do you touch your dog? And then when she said, well, actually, he's a very tiny dog and I just carry him everywhere and I kind of bounce him like a baby because he's my teddy bear. And I'm like, well, yeah, well, maybe that's why he doesn't want to interact with you. And of course, I tried to be nicer about it, but for her, it was super loving. Picking him up and carrying him as a baby. She really loves the dog, doesn't mean any harm, but she couldn't realize that way the type of interaction wasn't super fun for the dog. Well, then she was kind of sad, thinking, then my dog doesn't love me. I was like, well, that's not the question. Like, he probably really enjoys interacting with you in other ways. She was saying, yeah, he's always bringing me his toys, but I never play with him. Then I was advising, well, maybe you should interact more on his terms. And if he really likes playing with toys, then maybe you will have a better relationship with him if you play with toys instead of carrying him like a baby, which he clearly doesn't enjoy. Well, I don't know if she did, but I hope she did, because of course they would probably have a better relation if she's not only thinking of what she wants out of the relation, which is carrying him as a baby, but what the dog wants out of the relation.
Yeah, that's a great point. That actually segues really well into my next question, because of course, interacting with your companion animal on their terms is going to have a really positive impact on your relationship with them. Are there other ways that a person can build a positive relationship with the animals they interact with?
Food. But yeah, they don't like food, so it's quite useful sometimes if maybe the animal is not super comfortable with us or something. Food can always help us a bit, as Sasha was saying with the example of the horses. They do like food, and most animals do like food. But of course, it's not the only way of interacting. And I think playing is super fun for dogs, at least for most dogs, or many dogs like playing, and it's another way to interact that can be quite fun for both.
I think one thing kind of that goes along with interacting with them on their own terms is also taking a look at all the unnecessary things we're nagging our dogs about. So as I walk around Vancouver, there's a lot of instances where people using food, using positive reinforcement training, but still are asking dogs to, for example, sit every time there's a red light and before crossing the street, or every time they see a dog, they sit, or they have to do this to do that. And there's just a lot of requirements on the dog's behavior. And in some ways, it's not always a bad thing necessarily. It's not, training has some benefits as a trainer, but it always makes me think like, it's just so much nagging. There's so much kind of requirements and how frustrating it must be to live a life like that for an animal. Kind of imagine if you were in a relationship with someone who did that to you all the time. And I think a lot of the time when we think about how we relate to our pets, there maybe is this kind of like maternal paternal relationship to animals, but I wonder if perhaps it could be better defined as more of a friendship. And if it is more of a friendship, perhaps then it will change the way that we do certain things. Like, for example, do we really ask our friends to like sit every time, we stop moving or whatever it is? And so I've wondered a lot about that in the last couple of years, and really started looking outside in these dyads, kind of seeing people and dogs interact with each other, and really kind of seeing it from a very, very different perspective. Like, for example, I've noticed that there seems to be a large disconnect with some relationships where a dog is clearly looking at something super interesting. So from the dog's perspective, there's like a really exciting bird over there. Like it's so exciting. And the dog wants to tell the owner, because he might even look at the owner and then look at the bird. So have some kind of like social referencing going on and inviting the owner to share in this excitement of this bird. And then a lot of the times, or some of the times, not a lot of times, but some of the times you have this kind of difference where some owners will just tug at the dog and say, stop that, go away, come with me, stop looking at this bird, and just kind of find that annoying, frustrating, and just punish the dog for showing any kind of interest in their environment, or kind of inviting the owner to go with them to join in this exciting thing. But then there's some relationships that are very different. Like you see some owners do the opposite, where they notice that their dog is interested in something and they'll share attention. They'll be like, oh, that's so cool. Like, let's go there and let's check it out. That's really interesting. And whenever I see that second type of relationship, my heart gets really warm, and it just feels nice, because that feels like there's actually a benefit to those relationships. There is not just like an angry, one, like, stop annoying me. But there's actually some benefit to it, that they're actually enjoying each other's company, which is lovely. And it again kind of made me think about if you had a partner who you would kind of tell them like, oh, look, there's this really cool, like, or there's a monster coming, whatever it is, like something either exciting or scary. And then your partner is just like keeps tugging you, just ignore that, let's keep moving. That's not a relationship you'll stay in, or you'd want to stay in. So again, I just wonder kind of how we actually answer our dog's behaviors is rather interesting to consider.
Although my parenthesis is that I have a dog that after seeing the bird screams. So then sometimes I need to tag her or kind of redirect her, because I know that the next behavior is kind of screaming from the bottom of her heart because there's a bird. And well, sometimes we don't want that. So sometimes I may seem like this kind of owners, because they are not letting them do what they really want at that moment. But it comes from knowing her and knowing how she deals with different kinds of situations and how she has a hard time regulating her own emotions. So once she's really hyped up, it's going to be harder. And well, Sasha knows her. So sometimes, yes, I may say, okay, well, let's go check this out. And sometimes I may be like, no, we're not checking this out.
I'm sorry. Have you tried screaming with her? See what happens.
I could. I don't know. People already look at me weirdly. So maybe if we both scream, it could be extra fun. But yeah, it is definitely nice to share moments with the dog. And I see that a lot when I also, of course, watch people when I move out and about and see people with dogs. I see a lot of people who are like on the phone, just walking mindlessly at the dog, and the dog is sniffing something, but they tag and keep walking because they didn't realize the dog has stopped. And yeah, I don't like that, because I think it's a moment to share with the dog. So yes, sometimes, of course, it may be a bit boring every day to walk an hour with the dog, but I do try to pay attention to her in this time. And sometimes when I'm like, I like to, be listening to music, or I'm on my phone and the dog can do whatever. And it's like, well, but it's not a shared moment. Then it's just exercise.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, both of you. You're really bringing to mind my housemate. We went on a road trip with my dog, and they shared the front seat together, and they kind of got to be like siblings. And she sent me a video recently. She took Clover for a run. The video was really about what Clover wanted to do. It was like she's running, and in the video she's like, okay, Clover's taking me to her favorite beach, and then she sends me a video of them barking at each other because Clover loves to bark. And she's like, well, I'll bark back then. We can bark together. And it really shows that beauty of like seeing who the dog is. Like Clover really enjoys barking. She just loves it. She loves the sound of her own voice. And sometimes she's saying something and you figure that out. But other times she's just like, I love barking and I want to do it right now. So I do really appreciate that. And I think it's important to make those spaces for dogs like that who, maybe there are some situations where it's not okay to bark and you want to redirect the behavior and reward them being quiet and, give them distractions. But other times it's like, well, there has to be a nice time to be able to bark and to let that emotion out. So yeah, I appreciated that kind of screaming at the birds together comment. This kind of goes along to the next question. Many people think they can understand what their cat or dog is trying to communicate with them. What studies have been done on communications between guardians and their pets?
That's a really interesting one. Historically, in comparative cognition research, there's been some attempts at trying to understand what is language and whether non-human animals can engage in language. And of course, and this is not communication in that sense, like there's no debate at all whether animals can communicate with each other. We hear that, bird song, we see that continuously through body language, through play, through aggression. It's all communication, but in this sense of kind of a human sense of language. And early on, there's been a lot of research in primates to see whether chimpanzees or bonobos can be taught from an early age. So kind of fostering type studies where a newborn bonobo or newborn chimpanzee is taken into a human family and is raised together with a human child or raised in kind of a family and is taught sign language or is taught some kind of very, very human-like language. And in those experiments, even though they're quite kind of exciting to watch videos of, fundamentally, later on, scientists are in agreement that there really has never been a proper demonstration of any language-like abilities in that sense of non-human primates, whether it's through the use of sign language. There's no kind of vocal ability, so there's not been a vocal aspect of it, nor through kind of pressing buttons of symbols. And so in terms of that kind of aspect, that research has kind of taken a pause, but has been substituted with other types of research. And I wonder if Camila teaches a whole course at UBC on animal cognition. And so maybe I'll pause here and I'll let her discuss the recent research.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, I think those early on studies, of course, they are interesting, but yeah, they weren't very successful in teaching to speak. But then we are now like a lot of years from that, and we are still trying to teach our dogs to speak with buttons, for example. So it's like, well, why are we so obsessed with teaching animals to speak? And again, I think, at least to me, it's more valuable to try to understand them in their own terms and to dedicate all that energy and time to do something else with them, which, I mean, sometimes is good because some people are using so much energy and so much time interacting with the dogs, trying to get them to use buttons to speak, that they are spending time together, but maybe they could be spending time together doing something else that's more fun for the dog. And I don't think we need those kind of buttons to actually understand our animals. Like we are actually, sometimes we are not totally great at that, as we said with the case of the therapy dog. Sometimes maybe the handlers may not realize all of the times the dog is stressed, or maybe they do realize, but they are still kind of pressure in the situation because, of course, the child wants to keep petting the dog. So they say, well, okay, it's fine. So it's a bit of a hard situation too. But I think if anybody who interacts with a companion animal, especially in the case of dogs and also cats, you can understand, like, if they want you to open the door or if they want you to play, or they don't need to press a button or have something that's human-like to tell us how to interact with us, I think. So I'm not a super fan of those kind of projects. But yeah, I do think it's possible for people to understand dogs or cats or whatever using their own behaviors. And there is a whole line of research that's focused on showing behavior, in which, for example, you have a dog and you're in the house or in a space in which you can hide some things, and then the owner or the person that's familiar with the dog goes away from the room and you hide something, and the dog is the one that knows. And you need to see if people will find things based on their dog's behavior. And actually, people are quite good at following their dogs, and the dogs are quite good at showing things. And that's an interesting, but they usually only show things that are interesting to them. So when people try to get them to show like office supplies or something, dogs are like, no. But if you hide a toy, it's probably very easy for the person to realize where the toy is in the room, because the dog is directing a lot of behaviors towards the place where it's hidden to the person, alternating their gaze or barking or touching the place or trying to paw at the place, and it's quite obvious. But if you hit like a stapler, then you're probably not going to find it through your dog.
I think there's a lot of the ways that I think we do teach dogs to communicate with us, for sure, because if they want us to do something, they have to successfully show it to us. So, for example, in all the cases where the dogs have learned to approach the door and then sit in front of the door and then kind of alternate gaze between the door or stare at the door intently to indicate that they want to go outside. So all of those are taught behaviors. The owners didn't necessarily teach the dogs that, like train the dog formally in that way, but just through experience, that if the dog happened to be by that area, the owner then understood and reinforced that behavior by allowing the dogs to go outside. And so kind of naturally, these types of communications between the owner and the dog happen. So I think direct training is not even almost necessary. Just by kind of occupying the same space and responding to each other's needs could be quite sufficient to create these kind of communication abilities between human and animal.
I think it's amazing to think about sort of like where we've come from, like the studies in the 60s with dolphins that were pretty awful, and coming to a place now where all of the communication studies are focused on kind of giving animals the best chance at expressing themselves and trying to really understand them from their own perspectives. What are some of the benefits and challenges with the scales and measures that researchers use to gauge their bond with animals?
I think the main one, of course, is that a lot of them are survey-based or questionnaires. So, for example, like one that's very popular is the lab's Lexington Attachment to Pet Scale, which is very frequently used, and it's asking the question of how attached the human is to the animal. And so that is very valuable for researchers to kind of get a sense of the human. And of course, there's plenty of surveys like that, and that's a very human-directed or human-centric type of inquiry. In terms of assessments of the opposite of how attached or what is the relationship from the animal to the human, so kind of asking questions of the animal is more complicated because, of course, we have to then devise various types of behavioral tasks and then assume that what it is that we're measuring is actually measuring the thing that we think we're measuring. So that's a bit of a challenge. One of them is, for example, the Ainsworth attachment was devised originally between mother and child and then kind of adapted to a dog and owner scenario. And it involves a whole bunch of departures and entrances by the owner, leaving the dog alone, and kind of looking at the kind of attachments, or at least the interpretation of the test is that the attachment style of the dog is revealed, whether it's secure attachment, which is when the owner returns, and the dog is then kind of greets the owner, but then goes on and interacts with other objects, engages in play behavior, compared to an avoidant attachment style, for example, when the dog does not greet the owner upon return and just kind of looks like they're mad at the owner, kind of stays away from the owner. But all of this, of course, is then our interpretation of the behavior. So that's always kind of very tricky because we don't actually have any kind of gold standard where all we're doing is matching up one test result to another test result and kind of looking for correlations ultimately.
Pretty much, we never quite know. And even if we are testing something in a lab, of course, we may prepare the situation so it works better in the lab, but it may not be exactly the same as it would happen in other situations in the life or in their own home. But sometimes you can. For example, I think it's super cool when with the pandemic we learned to use Zoom for a lot of things, and we can also use Zoom to test dogs in their own house, and that's just quite interesting because then you have like a video call with the owner and you use the computer as the camera, and then it is a bit more like this normal life for them because there is not a person coming in the house, or it's not that the dog is going into the lab, but of course you lose a lot of other control in the situation because you don't know what else is in the room, or maybe the cat walks by or somebody comes in, and you have a lot more control if you are in a lab. So I think, of course, both are valuable, and the best way is always using different types of assessment. So you may do a survey, and then you may do something that you test in one type of situation or in another type of situation, and so on. Yeah, I think, as Sasha said, the surveys are really interesting, and there are a lot of them. But yeah, sometimes they do depend on the interpretation of the owner of the behavior of the dog, and sometimes they may not realize some things, or they may not want to share some things, especially, I don't know, if you have like a therapy dog, you may not want to say, my dog is out of control, or for example, in one of the impulsivity scales, or my dog gets excited, out of control in situations, or my dog behaves in this particular way, because then you have to say that about your dog, and you may feel like you're going to be judged as a bad trainer or handler. So some people may not feel comfortable with that and may not want to say negative things of their dog, or some other people kind of need to vent about the dog, so they may score everything quite negatively. But in truth, if you were to see their actual relationship or to see how they interact in real life, may not be quite as bad.
I have had a lot of questions about how, for example, some of the surveys or questionnaires that are designed to look at breed differences and still rely on kind of the owners answering questions. For example, there's a questionnaire that's very widely used in research called the CBARC, stand for Canine Behavior
Research questionnaire is the last part. Assessment.
assessment. Very nice, thank you. The CBARC, and it has a whole bunch of questions about the behavior of the dogs that the owners reply, that the owners answer. It's devised by Dr. James Serpel and then refined for a while. And one of the things that I thought was really, really interesting when I was a graduate student, if you look at the outcomes of breeds, the Greyhound is very, very low in aggression, very low on kind of all kinds of problem behaviors from the CBARC data. And then I had an opportunity to assist with Greyhound rescue. And there was a lot of Greyhounds coming in with reactivity issues, with a lot of kind of struggles on the leash, with a lot of, honestly, a little bit scary behavior for me. And I was so surprised because I had this from just reading the data. I'm like, oh, but the Greyhounds are meant to be so nice and gentle and calm. What's going on? And then I kind of delved into the relationships that owners of Greyhounds have with their Greyhounds. And I kind of think this is very anecdotal, but I have a suspicion that Greyhound owners are potentially thinking about the Greyhound as a little bit different than other animals. So in the sense that if you might notice that Greyhound owners, I don't know if, not so much in Vancouver, but I know in the US, they always kind of keep them very, very tight leashes. Kind of the Greyhound is always, because it's a big dog, so everyone is always kind of on a very controlled environment, and the dogs are not allowed to interact with other dogs. They're always only muzzled if they're engaging with others. And so there's a lot of very different types of management strategies that, at least in the US, owners of Greyhounds have. And I've observed many cases where, as I'm looking at this dog, I'm seeing a lot of reactivity, but the owner is not, because that's just normal Greyhound behavior, and they wouldn't necessarily think of that as reactivity, and Greyhounds are not reactive. And so I wondered if this is a case where kind of breed stereotypes actually perpetuate and then alter the results in scientific inquiries themselves, and then it perpetuates again and again and again. And I think I've observed that in the shelter environment with breed labeling, that if someone is labeled as a German Shepherd, perhaps the owners might kind of allow the dog to get away with things, guarding behavior. Well, it's a German Shepherd, it's meant to guard, compared to maybe a different breed, a Golden Retriever. If a Golden Retriever growls, that's not appropriate. Golden Retrievers are not meant to growl. And so I think there's a lot of this human imposed kind of acceptance of certain things and not acceptance of other things, which I think also change the way we then respond on that behavior and kind of determine whether it's appropriate or not appropriate, and how much we should kind of fill out those questionnaires a little bit differently as well. And so I wonder a lot about the kind of the owners themselves, how they are biased kind of for or against their own breed in that sense. But then also I wanted to talk about a different situation where behavioral assessments have really, we also struggle with kind of trying to figure out what a behavior assessments actually kind of do. I had a PhD student, Kelsey Brown, who did her dissertation on sociability assessments in shelter dogs. And she was interested on the validity of assessments, behavioral assessments generally in the shelter, and she really focused on sociability assessments because they seem to be the most robust. This is a question of whether the dog is social to strange humans. And what she did is that she conducted, on the same dogs, different people, she conducted various sociability tests, the same sociability tests on leash, off leash. She also looked at whether the test was conducted with her in a chair, kneeling versus standing, kind of all of these very, very, very small procedural differences that are not ever accounted for in the shelter environment. But she saw that social behavior from the dogs was very, very different depending on kind of the presence of a leash or no presence of a leash, or if the person was sitting, standing, or kneeling down. And moreover, when she ranked the dogs based on sociability, kind of who's the most social, who's the least social, once you've kind of altered some procedural differences, that ranking also flips over as much as you want. And so there was really no predictive value. So essentially, there is no validity to the behavioral assessment, which is scary. It's definitely scary for the most obvious kind of scary part is that we're euthanizing dogs because they don't pass some tests in the shelter. But also, it's quite scary for researchers because when we kind of conduct these sociability tests, and then, for example, we look for a gene of sociability or, whatever it is, it's very much dependent on what tests, and not even a test, but what procedural small variation we have selected, how that will kind of reflect on the data. And speaking of, Camila is actually engaging in a really cool project that's across different laboratories where there is an attempt to replicate simple behavioral experiments that we kind of already think we know about in dogs across different laboratories, the Many Dogs Project. Maybe, Camila, I think this is quite relevant there.
Yeah, definitely. So the Many Dogs Project is a multi-centric project. It has about 50 researchers across the world, and the idea is to try to do the same experiment in different parts of the world with different dogs, more or less with the same setup as much as we can, make it similar and see what happens if you do the same test. And the first project was on pointing, which is something that has been extensively studied in dogs. And then we tried to see what would happen teaching, testing pointing in different labs and how, well, not all dogs were so great at this, although it was on purpose. It was selected one type of pointing that's quite hard to follow. So many dogs failed, and that was a hard task. But it is super interesting from the point of replicability and open science to have the different people conduct the same tests or a very similar test and see what happens in different populations too. So yeah, we are now cheering up for the second project. But I don't know if I would say a simple one because now we are going to be looking at over-imitation, which is the ability of dogs to imitate the human demonstration of how to complete a task. So it's not super simple, but again, it's going to be really interesting to see what happens with dogs across the world in that test.
Thanks so much for sharing all of that. I can really see how different setups for studies would have big trade-offs in terms of the way you capture the data and the replicability of it and the sort of accuracy of the behavior. Certainly, I've noticed, with my own dog, how different environments impact her behavior drastically. And I kind of, in a way, it's the same with us as humans, and it's interesting to imagine, okay, how do we in research try to capture that level of variability that exists in all beings such that the study still gives us data that's useful and makes an impact going forward in human and animal interaction. I'm curious, kind of thinking about that and using data, how human-animal bond research gets put into plain language and made accessible for the public.
It's difficult in the sense that if we were a science that had used very complicated terminology, like in physics or in chemistry, I think there would be less interest, of course, in our science. There's a lot of interest in the science of human-animal relationships and dog behavior, dog cognition. But because it's rather accessible and because everyone has a dog, everyone has a cat, there's a lot of misconceptions that get perpetuated and misunderstanding of the data as well as it's published. And so a lot of the times, I remember being quite frustrated with it early on, but I've stopped reading now, the news reports. But when we conduct research and we discover something, then you look at kind of what reporters would write about it. A lot of it, the reporting is not particularly accurate because I guess it connects so easily to the reporter's own experiences with dogs or maybe something they heard on TV. And so I think there's a bit of more danger of kind of reporting not exactly accurately and reporting towards the kind of interest of the viewer rather than the reality. I don't know if it happens less or more in other sciences like in physics or chemistry, but I suspect less because it's harder to kind of connect that to the world that we're living in. There's also, I think, romanticism that guides reporting a lot of the times in human-animal interactions. Like, for example, I think if you ask the layperson outside if there's been research demonstrating the benefits of therapy animals, for example, or a question is animal-assisted interventions useful? I think overwhelmingly we will say yes, because that's what's being reported, because that's what we want to know, that's what we want to hear. But we go to conferences, we'll see that it's probably about 50-50, that we have quite a lot of negatives, we have a lot of no effects, mostly no effects, some benefits, but that's not going to get reported. And so I think there's a lot of reporting bias towards the positive on the human-animal interaction side.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, for example, the horses thing, people may not want to report. Horses don't like when kids groom them, or a percentage of therapy dogs wants to escape when they see a child. It's nice to share with the public, so it may not get shared, that may be misinterpreted, because of course it's also not the opposite. It's not like therapy dogs hate children. That also would be bad. But so sometimes it does get reported in ways that is not the way the original study meant to report information. But I think that's quite common in a lot of fields. And yeah, it does create misinformation that gets repeated, and of course it makes things worse.
And there's also the point where, because everyone has an opinion about companion animals, there's a lot of comments about like, well, why do we devote research dollars to this topic, I could have told you that myself, kind of thing. And of course, in hindsight, perhaps the best data are the ones that are explained pretty easily. And of course, if we had the opposite data, someone else would say the same thing about, oh, well, I could have told you that as well. And of course, that is why we need data. But I think dog scientists definitely have to grow some kind of tough skin or just not read news reports.
Yeah, I'm really interested to see where this goes, communicating these findings with the public, because we're lucky and it's kind of dangerous that we're in the information era where anyone can share anything on TikTok or something. So like a dog trainer can share negative reinforcement techniques, or someone can share really educational content about how to understand your dog's body language. So I think that I'm really interested to see where that goes. But I think that's everything we had for today. So thank you so much for joining us to speak about all this, Sasha and Camila. It was so helpful to hear about your research work and have the chance to chat about the bonds we share with our companion animals. And to the audience, if you'd like to learn more about Camila and Sasha's work, we'll link to the research we mentioned in the blog post accompanying this episode at vancouverhumane.ca/podcasts. Thank you so much for listening, and please join us again next month as we talk about the last decade of investigations into farmed animal cruelty in BC. The Informed Animal Ally is a podcast by the Vancouver Humane Society. If you found this episode helpful, please consider giving us a 5-star rating and review to help us reach more supporters of animals. To support this project and other initiatives to build a kinder world for animals, you can make a donation at vancouverhumane.ca. You can also follow the Vancouver Humane Society on Facebook at Vancouver Humane Society, Instagram at Vancouver Humane, or Twitter at VanHumane. The music in this episode is the song Jonah's Message for New York by Dr. Turtle, licensed under the Creative Commons Attribution 4.0 International Public License. Thank you for listening, and thank you for being an animal ally.